She trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms. It was a small, terrible detail, the way her cheek had found the hollow at the base of his throat, the way his hand had settled along the curve of her back as if learning the geography of someone else's quiet. Desire had come to her like an etiquette, a learned recess of the body made polite by champagne and introductions. He had given her a house, framed in cedar-smoked size and a key that matched the width of the invitation he handed her, so that the act of being chosen would become part of her daily architecture. The present hung over her life like a tasteful portrait hung at the right height, meant to be seen, rarely questioned. The house had been, in every way, the sort of gift that announces an ending and a beginning at once. Rooms opened into each other with the confidence of people who expected good manners from space. High ceilings, broad windows that swallowed rain into chiaroscuro, lights that woke at the sound of a name. In the hallway, a tall mirror caught the chest of visitors like a snapshot, returning a slightly delayed echo of a face as if the house itself were thinking a second after you did. A cedar box lay beneath the mirror. The scent was thin, persistent, the pleasant, humanizing scent someone chose because it suggested care. Doha knew how to choose things. He moved in the city with composed precision, flattering introductions that left the edges of strangers smoothed. He had an easy laugh that fit the right beat of conversation, and a wardrobe that suggested inevitability. Soft cashmere, shirts cut with a line in the wrong place that still managed to look casual. He told stories that landed like small polished stones, skimming across the surface, leaving ripples without burden. People liked being near him because being liked is, for some people, a kind of currency. Julia, who had learned to count small attentions as proof of her own desirability, accepted his selections, as if they were confirmation of a life suddenly designed for her. She told herself she wanted the house because it was beautiful, the way morning folded along the stairwell, the precise hum of the kitchen lights when she tapped them awake, the plush couch whose crevice invited the winged shape of a body during long Sunday afternoons. But beneath that practicality was a softer ledger, Doha's hand on the small of her back, the way his presence smoothed the edges of evenings. To be chosen, she thought, meant one no longer had to watch the world for risk. It was a surrender that felt like ease. Small, almost absurd comforts began to settle in. She learned how Doha liked his coffee, black and warm, left untouched for a set number of minutes, and how he preferred the living room light dimmer by the third sip. He left cedarwood-scented candles in unexpected corners, their smell becoming an anchor that linked him to the house. The scent arrived before he did sometimes, a clean, woody halo that made the rooms feel lived in and unthreatening. When they slept, the house held them like a story with a generous margin. On the rare mornings when she woke before him, she would watch the neat lines of his face and tell herself that there were no small things more honest than the slow breath of another. But ease, particularly the kind wrapped in luxury, is porous. It admits small dampness, a misaligned sentence in an otherwise polite conversation, the faint echo of a laugh that didn't quite correspond to a face. For Julia, these dampnesses sat like moth tracks across the fabric of her trust. They began as things she could name as odd. Doha's precise awakenings, his departures that were never announced, but always executed with a neatness that made her think of rehearsed exits on a stage. He slept with a calm that had a note of repose too calculated to belong to a man with a conscience. He woke as if he'd had no unsettled dreams at all. Once, in the middle of an afternoon, she swore she saw his image in the hall mirror lag a fraction, as if the glass were holding back one of his breaths. She told herself she had not slept enough. She told herself that was where suspicion lived, tiredness wearing the face of imagination. There were other small things. Her phone would flicker white when she tried to record a view she wanted to keep. Sometimes a photo she thought she'd taken in the living room came back with a smudge of shadow, where a couch seam met the floor. Sometimes the file saved but played with a humming silence, audio gone where she expected to hear ordinary noises. Once late at night she set her camera to record the living room, because an uneasy thing in her was keen to learn whether the house's quiet was merely a matter of comfort or the cultivation of a kinder loneliness. The footage, When she opened it the next day, began with a clean image and then fell to an abrupt white blank, as if someone had opened and closed a curtain at the exact instant the thing she sought would have moved. She mentioned these irregularities to Kem with the awkward voice of someone offering a confession. Kem had been in her life longer than most, an unostentatious friend whose skepticism worried at the edges of her sentiment. He had a thermos he carried like a small, durable ballast, and an instinct for paperwork that made him believe in the world's ability to be logical. "Maybe it's the light," he said the first time, practical. "Maybe it's a camera glitch." He listened to her while she described cedar like a scent that might be used to misdirect. "Maybe he's a good liar," he added after a beat, the sentence a soft cutting edge that left her feeling, briefly, exposed. Julia's mother was different in the way only mothers can be. A catalog of warnings made of experience rather than accusation. She stitched concern into phone calls like a seam that would hold. "Keep the doors locked," she would say, and the words tasted of old maps, of neighbors who watched too closely, of violence that found people who were too trusting. Her mother's voice was not dramatic. It was old enough to resemble a law. Once, when she visited, she stood longer in the hallway than was necessary, and ran a hand over the cedar box, as if the scent might tell a story if rubbed hard enough. Doha's charm was a kind of social armor. It made the objections of the world seem temporarily silly. The house, with its crafted menus and polite staff, had been built to host. It absorbed opinion like fabric. When his name was mentioned, people inclined their heads as if asking permission to think. He was known in the ways people in certain circles are known, by the clubs he seemed to choose, the parties he hosted that ended with the same curated hum of laughter. He had friends who would speak for him, neighbors who noted his kindness. When Julia brought up the camera glitch, she felt it was disproportionate to the evidence she could muster. She felt extravagant to worry. Still, some worries insist on being taken seriously because they are small enough to be persistent. Julia began to catalog them with the sort of diligence she was used to applying to accessories, the shadow in photographs, a cushion that bore an imprint not quite like a human body, the way the cedar scent seemed to concentrate around the couch, even when Doha had been away for hours. She found a faint ring of dust on the underside of the coffee table, as if something had been dragged there, and then wiped away with the gentility of a staged scene. Once she noticed a single small button tucked in the gap where the couch met the floor. A plain, gray button she did not recognize. Doha told her it belonged to a coat he had once lost and never retrieved. It was the sort of answer that fit the problem with the ease of a well-cut glove. She tucked the button into a drawer, and though its presence pulsed inside her as a question, she told herself it was a superstition to keep it. On an evening when rain coated the city in a gray that made the windows of bars and galleries look like paintings, she strolled to the end of the block and watched traffic move through the reflection in a shop window. There was a small arrogance to the way people went about being themselves, a stubborn insistence on living like proof against the idea that the world could be otherwise. She thought of his laughter. It had softened her like a warm garment. It was easier, she told herself, to be deceived by elegance than by cruelty. If the question of his nature had an answer, she preferred the simple one. He loved with a style she had not yet learned to translate. But curiosity, once given room, does not tidy itself. She began to follow habits. Where he left his shoes by the door in a perfected row, the direction he walked when he excused himself from a conversation, the manner in which his coat hung from a hallway hook, as if it had not been worn recently. She would sometimes watch from a doorway while he moved across the room, waiting for the small detail that would make sense of what she felt. Often there was nothing, only the pattern of a man's life lived as theater. Once she stayed in the kitchen after he had gone to bed and listened to the house fold into its nightly routine. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere a steam pipe ticked. She tasted a quiet like a sleeping room. It was then that she began to count off the nights on her knuckles to practice the way one practices small penances. Watch, wait, notice. There was a night in late autumn, when the sky opened with the nervous sound of rain on metal, and she could not sleep at all. The house had been given to her as a promise of mornings and upheld appearances. It had also become the place where suspicion could be nurtured into enough clarity to mean something. That night, it felt necessary to stay awake, to watch not for vindication, but for the truth of her own senses. She told herself she was being dramatic. She told herself she needed evidence more than Cain-bruised feelings. It was not piety or accusation that woke her. It was the old pragmatic requirement of verifying an intuition. She slid from bed into the stairlight and down to the living room where the couch lay like an island of calm. The automated lamps were programmed to lower with a soft click when they sensed the house to be unoccupied. She made sure they were generous enough to illuminate without making the shadows blunt. She wrapped herself in a shawl and sat on the edge of the couch with the patience of a person who has learned to wait for answers. Her phone was set to record the room, propped on the low table in front of her. She had a small thermos of chai, the kind Kem liked, and a note to him that read simply, "I'm watching." She would not say it aloud. It kept to her throat like a small prayer. Doha returned later than usual. He did not tip any small courtesy toward her vigilance. He let himself in as if he belonged there, precise as ever. He moved through the living room with the kind of economy that suggested he was accustomed to surveillance without being watched. He changed. His movements had that practiced efficiency of someone who knew which clothes would be appropriate for which audience. He sat some distance from her on the couch and read a book as if they were two people in the same scene, whose proximity did not necessarily mean presence. She watched his hands rest on the paper, watched the light play across the lines of his knuckles. Once a shallow breath escaped him and he shifted. The house inhaled around him. The cedar scent concentrated at the back of her throat. She felt ridiculous and terrible both at once. There was a tightness in her chest that had the shape of a question. When she saw the tail, it did not arrive with a triumphant flourish. It was a slow, patient thing, appearing from beneath the couch like the end of a river revealing itself at the shore. At first she thought the shadow was a trick of the lamplight, a folded blanket pushed under the seat. Then a band of something cool and luminous emerged, a rounded scale catching light like a polished stone. It moved with an intelligence that made the air seem shifted. The room seemed to exhale around the appendage's presence. It was not the long, flailing horror of a monster as imagined in stories. It had the dignity and economy of a thing that had practiced its motion for generations, the way a snake slides with deliberate, unhurried arcs. There was an oddness to its texture that the mind tried to translate into known objects, marble cool to the touch but flexible, a filament of iridescence that carried no sound. It made no hissing. It came and uncoiled with a patience so precise that her first thought was only of the way it fit the geometry of the couch, like a secret placed there intentionally. Doha had his back to her as the tail revealed itself. He was a human shape in the same room as this impossible thing, and for one staggering moment, the two existed simultaneously without the exchange seeming to contradict the other. When the tail's band brushed against the floor, and then, as if deciding better of it, pressed a slight arc beneath the couch cushion, she moved, slow as a person underwater, to the spot where the appendage met the carpet. The light caught on a seam of tiny scales. They were cold even across a distance. The knowledge of the cold had a sensory honesty that made her stomach tilt. She reached for the cushion, intending to lift it to see what lay beneath, some implement, some elaborate prank, and the phone on the table set to record, flashed as if the screen itself had been startled and then turned to honest, blank white. When Doha shifted, as if stepping out of a dream to find himself in a living room with someone awake, he looked over at her with an expression that would later make every retelling begin in uncertainty. His face was composed and apologetic, the kind of human face that asks forgiveness for imagined neglect. "You needed something?" he asked, voice casual. She opened her mouth and closed it, the facts of what she had seen caught behind the barrier of its impossibility. The appendage did not make any sound. It moved with an animal patience that belonged to river stones and tides, and when it pulled away it left no print but a faint scent of cedar, as if affirming its author. She was the kind of person who noticed things, fine fabrics out of place, the shape of a laugh that did not match a set of lips, and she had a small private vocabulary for disbelief, patterns, repetition, denial. This would be described later as the moment she stopped pretending that flattery was not itself a kind of danger. For now, the house kept them both in its light, and nothing else agreed with her memory. When she tried to capture the scene with sound, her pulse, the uneven breath when the tail had slid, her phone whispered a brief, hissless static, and then went black. The camera that had been fixed to the mantel, a small device that belonged to the house's security package, registered an empty frame at the time she had set it to record. The file existed as a blank with a timestamp where footage should have been. It was an absence with a technical gloss, plausible, explainable, and therefore infuriatingly useless. Doha rose then and crossed to where she sat, obliging the intimacy she had once associated with safety. He touched her shoulder in a way that was practiced, an older husband touching a young wife on television. His hand was warm, his eyes were composed. "You scared me," he said, not a question, but a small performance of tenderness. "You always give me that look. Promise me you'll sleep. The house is silly at this hour." She wanted to tell him everything, to say aloud the exact physics of the sense that had unmade her night. Instead, she sat with the shawl like a thin armor, and let him smooth the creases from her expression, with the gentleness of a consummate actor. He kissed her brow and made a joke about the power failing at the wrong times. His nails, when they brushed her skin, were clean. He smelled of cedar. After he went to bed, she held the tiny gray button in her palm, where it had fallen into the open seam, and rolled it between finger and thumb until the edges began to hurt with the rhythms of worry. It felt like a talisman and nothing like evidence. She knew, in some small way, that a button could not be the thing that saved her story, that the weight of a button could be used to tip a conversation but not to overturn an alibi. Still, she wrapped it in a scrap of paper and slid it into the inner pocket of a drawer, like someone hiding a confession. She did what people do when their senses have been betrayed by an event that feels too private. She called Kem. He arrived with the certain practicality of someone who believes a problem can be touched into being. He brought a thermos, his logic, and a slow, steady way of asking questions without insinuation. They sat side by side on the couch with the living room lights turned up high, as if illumination could be a kind of forensic honesty. Julia spoke in sentences that trailed off into the small noises of the city, a distant siren, rain on metal. She told him there had been a tail and a seam and a cold like marble. Kem asked for details in the manner of one taking down an inventory, where exactly, how long, what light, any sound. He did not laugh. He did not offer easy answers. He simply took in what she offered and converted it into a list. The security company came the following morning and moved through the house with the ceremonial seriousness of professionals who have been trained to lend certainty to anxious palms. They checked the wiring, the sensors, the camera logs, and then they checked them again. They rewired a fixture that had been intermittently failing and recommended replacing one of the battery packs. "Sometimes these systems have blind spots," one of them said, apologetic, as if arranging for a future where their competence might make up for current emptiness. Their gestures were neat and corporate and plausible. They left a report that might have sufficed for someone who needed to be reassured. But reassurance did not answer the heavy way in which the tale had cooled the inside of her with the sense of otherness. She told the police because telling a system allows it to begin its bureaucracy of care, which is often measured in forms and timestamps. The officer who came listened with a professional patience that was slowly wearing thin, as every uncomfortable thing is that asks for paperwork and gives only emotion in return. "We can take a report," he said. He typed. He asked where the cameras were, and whether she had DNA swabs or fingerprints. His face carried the kind of sympathy that was married to skepticism. When she handed him the phone file, the one that blinked to white at the point of the event, he muttered something about corrupted files and the way technology sometimes fails at critical moments. "We'll send a unit by," he added, as if that might produce an answer in the same way a key opens a lock. Nothing in the house registered anything but a normal household. Neighbors were polite but private. Questions smoothed into the kinds of small talk that offshore concerns into rumor. Someone mentioned that Doha had been seen at a gallery opening earlier that week. Another said the man had an impeccable reputation. A neighbor who occasionally walked his dog said he'd seen nothing odd. The world, which is constructed of small reciprocities and the business of not seeing, leaned away from her. She felt watched now by a community that conflated discretion with disbelief. Doha's biography, when she pressed, had seams. There were times he did not return calls, invitations that arrived late. Friends offered up contradictions like chips of a stone, each telling a different facet of a man who could be whatever the moment required. He canceled meetings without explanation, and then reappeared as if absence were the courtesy he could offer. His cards and social addresses were precise enough to construct a life of taste. They did not produce a lineage. One afternoon, after the security firm had left, and the officers had filed their notes into a folder that would be opened perhaps on a rainy day, she opened the drawer and found the button missing. She understood with a small, brutal clarity the way the house could refuse to keep a truth safe simply by the circulation of ordinary life. She checked the pockets of coats, the laundry, the seams of the couch. The absence made her remember the tale with a more alarming specificity. The scale catch of light, the patience of the ark, the cedar odor that clung to everything. Was she the kind of person who could be believed? She did not know. She had promised herself that the truth was more important than plea. For a week the house felt like a theater in which she had once seen backstage, and could not stand the artifice. She arranged cushions to window the floor better. She left a lamp on so that the room would not be cut into odd, suspicious pockets of dark. She walked the house attentive to the small sounds possessions make when they are properly human. The clink of dishes, the soft sigh of fabric settling. She began to sleep with the bookend of the door placed in a way that made a quiet click when opened, as if the little mechanism would make her body aware to any motion. It was not a rational defense. It was a way for her to say aloud that she would no longer be the kind of person who simply allowed tenderness to be translated into possession. Doha noticed the small changes with a smiling interest. He asked about her new habits with a tone that was half concern and half delight, as if she were revealing to him a new accessory. "You're making the house into a fortress," he teased once, his fingers idly catching the edge of a lampshade. When she asked if he had been somewhere the night of the tale, he offered a calendar of banalities: a late meeting, a walk with a client, a quiet hour alone. His answers were tidy. He touched her hand as if to bind the conversation into a softer thing. There was never an anger in him, only an inclination toward smoothing things into the shape they had when he arrived. In the closet where she kept sweaters she had a cedar sachet, and sometimes the scent seemed to make an argument. Sometimes it made a mockery. She learned to read the scent like a weather system. When the smell thickened in a room, she tightened the lines she put around herself. When it receded, she told herself she had been foolish to think the world could be otherwise than ordinary. Her mother stayed for a weekend and watched her watch the house. "You have to trust your senses," her mother said, a sentence that carried no instruction but instead a long-standing caution. But trust doesn't mean surrender. The words lodged like a splinter. Julia wanted to ask what trust would look like now. A locked door, a public confrontation, a trail of evidence that would convince people who had not been there. She wanted someone to say that the world would rally, and that formality would not be the same as dismissal. Instead, her mother made a pot of tea and insisted they eat something warm. They moved through the house like two people practicing a language together. On an evening swollen with that particular stillness rain brings to cities at the edge of winter, Julia set herself to the couch again. It is one thing to be certain in daylight, and another to have conviction when the world softens. Something in her had hardened into a watchfulness that was now its own vocation. She sat there while Doha read across the room, while rain scored the windows like a drummer impatient with the room. The house hummed like a patient thing. This time when the appendage emerged, it felt closer than before, as if the house had learned how to compress distance. The sight was identical, and also not. A band of scaled skin slipped free of the couch's shadow, and Julia felt the room tilt as if gravity had offered a suggestion. She moved toward it without thinking, as a swimmer moves toward a buoy, and as her fingers brushed the outer ring of something cold and unyielding, it made no sound. The scales were cool and slick with a moisture-like breath. They closed around the pad of her finger, with a pressure that was not violent, but intimate, like the hand of someone holding a person to a story. She heard nothing. There was no hissing, no animal cry, only the human world pulsing on the other side of the glass. Brakes, a distant radio, a door shutting. Her phone, ferocious with logic and the exactness of recorded time, simply died to black again. The camera on the mantel returned a white space like a paper that had been washed of ink. When she hauled back the cushion, the space beneath it was empty. The seam where the appendage had rested bore a faint, indistinct residue, a cedar tang and the impression of a curve. She called Kem first because he had been the person who, in the early rational stages of disbelief, had listened without laughing. He arrived with a calm that looked like a plan. They documented the seam. They took notes. Kem's voice became a ledger, date, recordings, devices. He checked the camera logs and then his face folded into a private annoyance. There should be, he started, and then closed the sentence because the world had offered him nothing else to say. The security company came again, more thorough this time, and introduced packets and forms that smelled faintly of bureaucracy's linen. The officers drew their flashlights along the baseboards and ruled out forced entry, then filled another report with details that did not amount to an answer. They left with the air of people who had done what they were paid to do. The absence of proof began to collect into a new, heavier fact, that the world would not conspire to bear witness for her. Institutions came with the language of procedure, and left having left no object to hold. Doha's reaction to their inquiries was what made the absence ache the most. He grew distant in a measured way, as if stepping back to allow some private life to be protected. When she brought up the incident, he declined a meeting to discuss it, choosing instead to send a text asking whether she was all right. His messages were precise, a string of carefully placed sympathy and hints of concern that never quite became accountability. He suggested they take a trip. The idea softened the edges and restored ease temporarily. He asked her to trust him. He kissed her for one moment. The way people kiss in photographs meant to suggest endless tenderness. The less the world agreed with her, the more alone Julia felt. Friends offered the bruised sympathy of people who attempt to reconcile loyalty to each other and to normalcy. Some started to distance themselves, perhaps because the sort of claim she was making required a belief she could not produce in anyone but herself. Gossip is a slow organism. It learns to move through the same spaces that affection does, and sometimes wins by sheer persistence. She found herself choosing who to tell with a new economy. Revelation felt now like spending currency. On the morning after the second night she could not entirely place, she found the gray button in a pocket of the robe she had worn the night of the vigil. It was absurd and intimate. The button had been returned, or perhaps she had failed to notice its earlier absence. She wrapped it again in paper and placed it into the cedar box beneath the hall mirror and closed the lid as if sealing a small confession. The act felt ritualized. It felt perversely like an attempt to make her own evidence into something sacred. There were practical things to attend to: changing the camera system, inviting friends to stay over, creating checklists of places to sit until she knew the pattern of the house. There were also the quieter, more dangerous modifications. She began to notice herself narrowing in the direction of vigilance, making lists of exits, learning the weight of doors. Desire had taught her to relax her guard. Being unmade by that relaxation taught her a more disciplined attention. Survival, she discovered, was not the same as revenge. It was a retraining of the senses, learning to see seams where once she saw polish. At a charity event some weeks later, amid canapes and polite applause, she watched Doha from across a room luminous with people. He moved easily through the crowd, his smile perfectly adjusted, and his hand rested at the small of a woman's back in a way that suggested ownership rather than affection. For a moment, thirst for proof flared so hot she thought she might speak across the room, ask him in front of others what he had left under her couch. She did not. Instead, She let herself be held to the careful choreography of the evening, watched him as if he were a painting she had seen before. People approached her with inquiries and compliments about the house and about how fortunate she was. Their voices were a kind of noise that insisted on life's ordinary details. That night, as she lay awake listening to the city and the house's small mechanisms, she realized that the world had not decided to protect her, nor to abandon her. It had simply continued in its habit of preferring stories that fit tidy frames. Her suspicion, once intimate and private, had turned into a skill she had to learn to carry with the same grace she had once given to being chosen. She was not a woman who would shout from rooftops. She had learned that accusation without evidence is an implosion, a collapse into solitude. She had also learned that quiet attention could be a kind of armor. Yet the knowledge did not make the nights easier. The house retained a sense of performance. Mirrors returned a fraction of hesitation where there should be none. The cedar scent held, and in its persistence she sometimes read it as a kind of signature. His presence mapped in the air like a reputation that would not wash. The button, wrapped in paper, rested at the bottom of the cedar box, a small thing that might mean everything or nothing. And that was precisely the trouble. Ambiguity is a more stubborn thing than proof because it cannot be litigated easily. She began to sleep in the living room with a lamp on, the bookend of routine keeping the room aware. On some nights she would wake to find the cushion creased in a way that suggested someone had been there after she had fallen asleep. On others, she woke to nothing and convinced herself that absence was blessing. She kept a list of times on a small notepad, refusing to let the pattern smear under the weight of forgetfulness. When she called the security company again, the technician frowned at the log and suggested the installation of a device that would record onto a physical drive rather than into the cloud. That way there's a local copy, he said. It sounded sensible. It sounded, too, like an attempt to trade faith for material. She took the device because she wanted the idea of a consequence to be available. The technician assured her it would be installed the next morning. That night, before sleep knotted the house into its usual rhythms, she thought of the man at the charity event who had asked after her, who had been kind and solicitous and then, as if remembering another presence, had clicked his phone off with a precise movement. She thought of the way desire had asked for the surrender of vigilance, how easy it had been to be softened into trust, because being chosen fills a cavity in you that sometimes feels like home. She had paid that comfort a price. A week later, with the recording device newly fitted and a sense of hope like a tentative stitch, she reviewed the footage with Kem in the dim light of the living room. They fast-forwarded the morning, rewound the moments when she thought she had seen movement, and then stopped at a frame that made her chest ache. White, blank, a perfect square of nothing where the appendage had been before. The timestamp showed the correct hour. The file had been saved, but it was blank in the precise second she needed it to show. Kem swore softly. "That's not usual," he said, and the sentence carried all the frustration of someone who wanted the world to have answers. Doa did not stay much longer after that. He said he had to leave the city for meetings that might run for days, and in the intervals, his messages were the sort of thin courtesies that now felt like armor, concerned, careful, and absent. He would call sometimes in the small hours with a voice that was all measured tenderness. He gave an impression of someone attempting to make amends for the sprains of life with the currency he knew best, attention at a distance. Each call became a riddle that suggested more about his ability to manage perception than to resolve it. On the morning she found the gray button pinned to the inside seam of a coat she hadn't worn in months, she considered the idea that the house had its own memory, its own way of arranging evidence like a game she had not been taught to play. Or perhaps she had simply misplaced it before and then retrieved it in the vertigo of her sleeplessness. The ambiguity sat in her like a physical weight. Later that evening, she sat on the couch and placed the button on the coffee table like a small offering. The living room was a map of what she had lost and what she might yet hold. She had not yet thought of confronting him in public, or of forcing a reckoning that the world might either accept or politely decline. She had not yet decided whether she wanted the house returned to a place of ordinary living, or whether she would make it a fortress of attention. There were nights when she imagined packing a bag and leaving the door open behind her, allowing the world to take a measure of her life and return it, unchanged, in someone else's hands. There were evenings when she set the button back in its paper and slid it into the cedar box, and told herself that to live with the knowledge of seam was a more honest thing than any attempt to prove it. It is easy to write the luxury of vengeance into a narrative, the moment of violent reclamation that makes horror a neat line. But that was not the world she inhabited. The threat that had wormed its way beneath the cushions of her life did not lend itself to such resolution. It was a quieter thing, predation and practiced social cloth. The house knew how to hide the evidence, and people learned to look away because looking in is expensive. Julia learned slowly and with the relentlessness of someone plotting survival, that what she could do was not to make the world see, but to teach herself how to live with a truth others would never certify. She began to move through the house like someone learning a new language. Where she'd once left the bedroom door swinging wide in the trust of love, she now traced the arc of the locks and counted the doors 2 or 3 times before surrendering to sleep. She arranged mirrors differently, angling them so that one pass through a hallway would show 3 different reflections in sequence. Her life narrowed into habits that read like a ledger of caution. A lamp on the bedside table, a line of shoes placed in a pattern, a thermos ready by the couch for Kem, or for anyone who might be called upon to witness. These were small things, the sort that did not register as drama, but that knotted the fabric of a life into something more disciplined. Months fissured into a rhythm she recognized by the weight of the cedar box under her palm. Friends retreated into a polite distance. Some offered care in ways that were tender but ultimately private. Her mother came less often, and when she did, the visits were quiet, like someone stepping into a room where the furniture has been rearranged by grief. Kem became a steady presence in the way of an anchor. Practical, necessary. A person she trusted even if he could not create evidence out of absence. Then, not a thunderclap but something like the slow turning of a sealed envelope, the first public whisper arrived. A gossip at a neighborhood gathering mentioned seeing a man who dressed with the same care as anyone who wanted to be liked. A man whose smile had a practiced asymmetry. People who attended the same events said they had seen him, here and there, with the same beige scarf, with the same neatness. The rumor was small and unverified. It grew like a fungus, not with the force of proof, but with the greater force of repetition. On a late Sunday, the community held a small barbecue in the courtyard, a sort of permitted conviviality designed to stitch neighbors back together after the years separate. Courtyard gatherings, a mosaic of folding chairs and paper plates, designed to make neighbors glance at one another with the polite tenderness of people who still preferred small civility over curiosity. The sun had lost some of its heat. There was a late light that made the bricks glow like warmed clay. Grills smoked in corners, and somewhere a child screamed with a sound that could have been alarm or joy. There is often no distinction in the first few years of a life. People threaded around each other with platters. Conversations leaned toward weather and local renovations, toward the kinds of confidences that are safe because they do not require answering. Julia came because absence is a kind of statement, and because she wanted to practice being among people who would not look for the seams she had begun to see in everything. She arrived with Kem at her side. He had a thermos filled with the sort of coffee that does not pretend to be more than fuel, and with the habitual tightness of someone attending a social thing as if it were a crosswalk to be navigated. Her mother had declined this time. The visits had tapered into quiet practicalities. Julia brought nothing but herself and the muscle of attention she had been cultivating. She wrapped it like a scarf around her neck and moved through the courtyard like a person learning to be steady with the small bones of public life. There were clusters of neighbors she recognized by the same habits they had. A woman who always wore her hair in a low knot. A man who checked his phone as if it were an appointment book with an emotional life. Conversation moved like a slow river, polite and surface sparkling. The air held the clean, woody memory of cedar from Julia's house, a scent she had begun to notice everywhere because something that registers as a signature tends to follow you once you notice it. She felt the scent oddly, like a hand at the small of her back. an involuntary memory of gloves and rooms and the way the cedar box had once sat beneath the mirror. He arrived without spectacle. He did not walk in alone so much as be present in the air of the space. There is a difference, subtle, between making an entrance and being assumed by the room. He wore the beige scarf that had been whispered about in the neighborhood, as if accessories could be a kind of herald. He moved through the clusters of bodies with the same gentle economy he had always used, a hand at a shoulder, a laugh that landed like a polished stone. People greeted him with that soft, obedient civility affords to someone who never forces attention, but commands it by making himself agreeable. Doha, insofar as a man can be a creature of selection, behaved exactly as his look suggested. Practiced, smooth, the smile shaped to the contours of other people's needs. When he approached the table where Julia stood, he did what he had always done best, folded a compliment into an ordinary observation and laid it at her feet like an invitation. "This place they did a good job with the grills," he said, voice casual. It was an ordinary sentence and also the sort of thing that could be retold in a biography of charm. For one small moment, in the face of him and his practiced ease, she felt the old pull of being seen in the right light. Kem nudged her then, a careful pressure at her elbow that felt like a lifeline. He had come with the vague intention of keeping watch in a way that was not theatrically protective, but quietly pragmatic. "You want to say something?" he asked, his voice low enough that the neighbors' laughter would not swallow it. There was in his question a ledger of possible outcomes. A public confrontation that would scare off those who preferred not to be surprised, or a private moment of reckoning that would produce an answer only for Julia. He did not push, only provided the option. She did not speak. She had rehearsed confrontation like people rehearse now the idea of giving a speech. Careful language, the evidence arrayed like a set of props. But she had also learned that evidence is not always the point. Sometimes the point is to know the shape of your chest in a room and to act from there. When Doha's smile reached her eyes, when he tilted his head in that familiar asymmetry, something inside her tightened. Not the raw fear of the first nights, but the slow, precise alertness of a person who has learned the geography of danger. For a second she saw, as if reflected in a plate of negligent foil, a curve that could have been a shadow or a scale. It vanished when anyone else blinked. He spoke to others, his sentences as small and deliberate as the steps of a careful animal. He moved through the company, leaving a trace of cedar in the air, a signature that was at once comforting and maddeningly familiar. He rested a hand at the small of a woman's back as she laughed. The movement was casual and gestural, and it left the woman flushed with the near privilege his attention implied. Julia watched him like a student might observe a demonstration, looking for a pattern rather than an abyss. For every neighbor who smiled at him with unquestioning appetite, there was another who did not notice the scent that followed him. At one point someone called for a group photo. It happens at these things. A desire for a memory that contains no edges. People clustered together, arms loose over shoulders, the camera at the front held by a neighbor with good lighting in mind. The neighbor counted and smiled. Someone called for eyes on the lens. The phone lifted. The click was near, and Julia felt her body remember every failed capture that had been played across her nights. She held her breath without deciding to, and let the camera coin the moment. When the phone lit up with the preview, a collective sound of small satisfaction moved through the group. Faces appeared as they had, slightly improved by the light. Later, an acquaintance with an eye for photographs would show Julia the image he had taken. In the center of the group, a man whose posture and haircut could have belonged to Dubai society pages stood smiling, very much like Doha. Only the space beside his hip had an odd, shallow arc in the angle of the shadow that did not belong to anything one would find on a person. In the printout, the shadow looked like a slow suggestion of a coil, a soft gradient of darkness that could have been a trick of the sun. To some eyes, it was nothing. To Julia's, it read like a sentence half-formed. When she asked the neighbor about the camera setting, the man shrugged and said the phone had a habit of washing out highlights now and then. The answer was plausible. It was also another small, unbearable absence. Doha came and stood near her when she was alone, long enough to let a glass of iced tea collect sweat on the table. He asked about the house with that particular phrasing affluent people use when they mean to remember someone without naming the specifics of the past. "Are you taking care of the place?" he asked. Beneath the politeness there was a bait neither of them took. He did not refer to the nights or the reports. He referred to the house as a thing that belonged to good taste. Julia found her voice steadier in the public arena than it had been in the private nocturnes. "It keeps me awake," she said, not an accusation, but a fact laid down like an object on a table. He listened with a practiced display of concern. "You should come to the gallery next week," he offered. "It will be good to get out." It was the sort of suggestion that mapped onto the life he offered, a calendar of appearances that smoothed edges instead of addressing them. There was charity in it. There was also displacement. Their exchange lasted in public time no more than a handful of sentences. Later, she would fold the moment in the cedar box along with the button and the memory of the tale. But for now, it was another small line in a ledger she had been forced to start keeping. A friend at another table waved and beckoned her to join a conversation about local schools, and she left Doha with an economy that felt practiced. She did not run. She did not call security or create a scene. She simply moved into the crowd and let herself be surrounded by people whose faces did not hold the capacity to unmake her nights. It mattered that she did not run. Part of the lesson she had learned was that panic is a narrative device in other people's stories, often serving to make a moment public enough for the world to react. But she had also learned that gathering proof is not the only form of survival. There is survival that consists of redefining the terms of your own life. She wanted now more than spectacle, a life where she could walk through a courtyard and not freeze at the scent of cedar like an animal hearing a distant drum. After the barbecue, she and Kem walked back to the subway in a late blue that made gutters reflect lamplight, like lanes of mercury. They moved as people who had been at a show together, actors in civility, keeping time. She told him later, in the low conversation of the walk, about the shadow in the photograph and the way the man had felt like a rehearsed gesture rather than a person. Kem listened. "Do you want me to go to the police with you?" he asked, practical as ever. His offer had the tremor of someone who had been awake with her in other houses, and who felt the weight of not being able to lend certainty. "No," she said. The single word had the finality of someone who had decided to hold the knowledge as a private asset. "I don't want to make him the thing he wants to be, a spectacle." She did not explain further. She had chosen a different kind of power, the refusal to hand over her story to those who prefer acts that can be televised. She would not reduce her nights to an accusation that the world could then sort into neat piles. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its strange elasticity. There were days when the world seemed content to go on with the business of polite living. Brunches, hair appointments, the slow economy of neighborly favors. But underneath there were the threads she had learned to recognize. A cedar scent in the corridor of a building she happened to pass, the same kind of scallop of a smile when she caught sight of a man at a gallery, the small repeated pattern of a hand which lingered on a sleeve a beat too long. Each one left its particular pressure on her chest. She modified rituals in smaller ways than locking doors and repositioning mirrors. She shifted the interior grammar of how she allowed herself to be seen. Where desire once asked for surrender, she now accepted only measured exchange. A dinner that ended at a certain hour, an embrace that had witnesses. When men smiled at her now, she catalogued the angle of their mouths, the precision of their gestures, the way their hands rested. The practice was less about paranoia than language, a way to read nuance. Months later, a rumor began to weave through the city's quiet circuits. A man with an easy polish had been seen at a gallery opening uptown. Someone had described a beige scarf and a smile that seemed to be practiced for the camera. Rumor walks differently from fact. It costs no evidence to carry itself. Still, it had the power to make someone like Doha, accustomed to moving between elegant houses and curated lives, appear briefly in places as if tracing out a map of social capital. The sighting reached Julia as an image passed among acquaintances, a photograph snapped at a party, a man in a crowd whose posture was familiar enough to unspool an old ache. She did not chase the rumor. Instead, she prepared a small list. Her friend list, the people who would be there, a route back home that avoided long alleys. It was the modest exercise of someone who had learned that preparation sometimes replaces confrontation. On the night she finally saw him again in public, it was at a small gallery fundraiser, an event that moved bodies through the rooms like a current, making them pass one another in polite arcs. She had come alone because Kem was traveling, and her mother had been detained by visits. The room smelled faintly of wine and the solvent tang of paint. People murmured over canvases. Dozens of pairs of shoes traced elegant patterns across the hardwood. He was there, as if summoned by the habit of being liked. He stood near a canvas, his hands folded at the small of his back, the beige scarf draped with the casual correctness that had once seemed like a kindness. People passed and greeted him. A woman stopped to put her hand on his arm in a gesture that signaled immediate familiarity. The sight of them in conversation made Julia feel, bizarrely, like someone observing a scene in which she had a fleetingly private interest. For an instant she considered interrupting, to ask aloud in front of others how a man who had been within her house so recently could now appear unremarkable here. She did not. Her hands were empty of evidence and full of the small skill she had been practicing. Attention. They exchanged glances, 2 brief flares in the public light. He recognized her as if the memory of someone is a card that you keep at the edge of your wallet. His face unfurled into that practiced, measured warmth, and his eyes held a question that might have been curiosity, or the practiced interest of a man who knows how face value works. For 1 second the gallery seemed to stop and consider the line of the moment, as if the art intended to become subject instead of object. In the reflection on the polished floor, she thought she saw something, a suggestion of a curve at the small of his back, an almost imperceptible modulation of shadow that might have been a coat, or might have been the echo of a seam. It was a perception so slender it could be a trick of light. She held it in the same drawer where she had kept the button, a private file labeled, "Not for public consumption." He approached, his gait steady, and when he reached her, he said in that same even tone, "Julia, you look well." He touched her forearm, only as one would when saying hello to a person whose company one values. He smelled faintly of cedar. She felt, as she had so many nights before, the odd pull of being seen in the right light. It is a hunger that lives in human bodies, and it is not shameful. It is simply part of the currency of social lives. "Do you still live there?" he asked. It was a question with many kinds of answers folded inside. She could have asked him where he had been that night, or whether he had anything to do with the things that had moved beneath her couch. The room around them would have been a place for a spectacle. People would have cheered at the ending of a private horror revealed. But spectacle had never been her real desire. What she wanted was the authority to name her own senses, to move in the world with a knowledge that did not require other people's performance. "Yes," she said simply. She did not ask for his leave. She made no accusation. Her voice held the steady cadence she had cultivated in recent months. It was the sort of answer that shifts a scene slightly, like a tilt that makes an image less comfortable to hold. He nodded, and then, in a gesture that was almost ritual, he looked past her as if to relocate something else he had been promised in the evening. In the small beat before he moved away, an expression passed over his face so brief that it would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching for seams. It was not a human expression so much as the translation of an economy practiced over years, an appraisal, a small measurement. For Julia, it registered like a shiver along a bone she had learned to use. She thought of the tail's patient arc, the cold of those scales, the way it had smelled faintly of cedar as if his presence had been inscribed with a scent. Someone in the gallery took a photograph then. A neighbor with a new camera who liked to capture friends in flattering angles. Later, when the image appeared on social media, the frame of Julia and Doha existed, but there was a white wash where his shoulder should have been, a precise absence that made people theorize camera error and lighting problems. The picture carried all the bland authority of digital images, It was a fact that could be explained away. It was another small thing to put in a drawer. After that night, she made a choice that surprised no one and astonished herself. She stopped expecting rescue from institutions, from friends, from spectacle. She assumed the world would continue in its preference for comfortable narratives, and that the man with the cedar scent would, as rumors suggested, continue to move through elegant rooms with the same practiced smile. Her solution was not to leave or to seal off part of her life from possibility. It was to arm herself with attention and to accept the ambiguity for what it was. Time does a work it rarely gets credit for. It softens edges while sharpening some of the more useful shapes. Months folded into one another. She learned to notice the difference between being watched by fear and being alert with purpose. The nights became a different kind of project. She taught herself to sleep with a lamp on, to measure the house in swift passes that were less about security theater than about mapping living spaces for unexpected incursions. She kept the cedar box under the hall mirror, and the button remained inside, an object that might have been evidence, might have been coincidence, but which, in its very ambiguity, had become something like a talisman. People occasionally asked her if she had moved on, some polite code for, "Are you back to being the person you were before?" She would laugh, a small sound that belonged more to the moment than to a reply. "Moving on is not the same as forgetting," she told a friend once, and the friend nodded as if that were a sensible thing to say. The truth was more precise. She had not returned to being the woman who accepted small acts of attention as proof of worth. She had not become a person who closed herself off entirely. She moved forward with a new grammar. The last scene the story will admit, because some endings are less a door and more an angle in light, happened on a wet afternoon in autumn. She was at a cafe that had a large window, one of those places where people read and pretend to write. The rain made the street a smear of reflected yellow and white, and the cedar scent seemed to follow her through the city like an echo. She was alone, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, when a man crossed the street and paused beneath the cafe's awning. He had the air of someone used to being observed politely. People glanced at him and then looked away. He was handsome enough to be remembered and ordinary enough not to warrant it. But for an instant, as their eyes met through the window glass, the world narrowed to a single, precise thing. He smiled in a way that replayed the same particular asymmetry Doha had used. The smile that had once unmade her sleep held for a fraction of a second, like a memory brought to the surface. She recognized it not with the language of fright, but with the economy of someone who stores patterns. Her body did not lurch. It registered. He did not enter the cafe. He turned and continued down the street, folding into the human traffic. His movement was ordinary. He had friends, a life, a set of possible biographies constructed of the same materials as any socialites. Appearances, usefulness, a cultivated likability. He might have been Doha in a new coat. He might have been someone else whose face converged on a familiar pattern. The ambiguity held. Julia watched the place he had been standing until the rain smudged it into a dozen smaller reflections. She finished her tea and left without following him. There was a small, sharp pride in the way she walked away. Not triumph, because there had been no victory, but a careful private steadiness. She had learned to live with the knowledge that some things do not resolve, and that the refusal to make them into spectacles is a kind of survival. She kept the cedar box in her pocket that day, its weight like a letter pressed between her fingers. At home, she opened the box and looked at the button, at the scrap of paper in which it was wrapped. The object was small and absurd and necessary in the way trifles sometimes are. It had been a means of calling the world to attention, and had instead become a private measure of truth. She placed it back, closed the lid, and for a moment the house felt like a body she had learned to inhabit on new terms, with guarded curiosity, with the patient labor of someone retraining the senses. The city continued to turn, indifferent in its vast, beautiful ways. Socialites kept their calendars and their appearances. The world remained a place where kindness and danger could be dressed in the same fabric. She had no appetite for dramatic reclamation. She did not want a public expose that would turn her nights into someone else's spectacle. The cost of that would have been more of herself than she was willing to surrender. Instead, she chose a smaller, steadier thing, the re-education of attention so that she would not be undone again by the soft currency of being seen. Sometimes, late at night, when the house sits with its rooms breathing and the mirror in the upstairs hallway throws back a double image that does not quite line up, she will stand and look at herself until the reflection becomes more than a trick. She will read the line of her face and the slope of her shoulders and count the ways she has changed. Desire taught her to loosen her guard. Betrayal taught her to notice seams. Both are parts of a life that, like any house, offers rooms of comfort, and the occasional corridor you are better prepared to move through with care. There is no final epilogue that places the creature in a taxonomy of the known. There is only the moral that was not taught as a doctrine, but discovered as a practice. Attention can be armor, and ambiguity can be an honest fact. She keeps her friends close enough to hold her days and far enough to allow them their own lives. Kem calls sometimes with a thermos of plans. Her mother visits and tucks small practicalities into her pockets like blessings. The cedar box remains under the mirror, the button inside, and on some mornings she opens it as if it were a small altar and breathes the faint scent and thinks of the nights she had learned to survive. If you have been looking for closure, you will not find it here. The man continues to move through rooms people do not notice. The rumor presses on without needing a proof. The camera files continue to offer their polite blanks when you most need them to speak. She did not unmake him. He did not become an object lesson. He retained the social mobility that had allowed him to be desired and harmless in public. But she, who had once surrendered to the ease of being chosen, learned another language. She learned to keep a lamp lit in rooms where she slept. She learned to angle mirrors so that a single pass gives multiple perspectives. She learned to trust the small muscles of notice, the way a hand rests, the smell that returns to a room like a signature. It was not triumph. It was not defeat. It was a life rebuilt on the quiet work of attention. If this story has landed like a shard in something you have been keeping tidy, tell us briefly in the comments. If you want another quiet, attentive story like this, subscribe.